Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for sticking around to the afternoon. As Kevin said, I'm Cayten. I'm a partner at CodeGreen. We're a sustainability consulting firm based in New York City. I have the esteemed privilege of working with the two of these great people on a day-to-day basis, helping them with their sustainability programs. But every year at this conference, I really do like to do a deep dive into some aspect of sustainability within the real estate industry. We get such a broad spectrum of topics throughout this day. Sustainable real estate is kind of sometimes in the shadows, sometimes in the forefront of more mainstream real estate investing and development that occurs, but I really like to shine a very, very strong light on the sustainability aspects of real estate every time we do this conference. So thank you for obliging me and bringing this to the table and bringing some experts here. I will have them introduce themselves in a moment, but really wanted to just lay out the context here a little bit that decarbonization, I think, is a 2-year-old word, 3-year-old word. You know, a couple years ago it was energy efficiency, then it was net zero. Decarbonization essentially is talking about reducing the amount of carbon emissions that come from buildings. Decarbonization is not really the right term. It's carbon dioxide equivalent, not just carbon. We need carbon. We're made of carbon. We're not trying to get rid of carbon. We're kind of trying to get rid of greenhouse gases. But one evolution that we've seen in the last many years, last 2 to 3 years, is a really accelerated push to decarbonize the real estate industry. And today we're going to be focusing primarily on operational emissions within buildings and how we're looking at reducing carbon emissions through operational emissions. We'll probably have some other topics down the road around what's called embodied carbon, which is the carbon emissions of building new buildings and all the emissions involved with that. So with that, I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself, but also your organization. Each of your organizations actually has sort of a different focus and portfolio build-up, so it'd be great to hear sort of where you're coming from. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Robbins Schneider. I'm Senior Vice President and Director of Energy, Sustainability, and Engineering at Empire State Realty Trust. Our portfolio is mostly based in New York City, mixed-use office, retail, and multifamily. Most famously, we own the Empire State Building, and we've leveraged our portfolio, and especially the Empire State Building, to demonstrate the techno-economic case for investing in deep energy retrofits to decarbonization.
Thanks, Mike.
Good. Hi, everyone. Michael Daschle. I'm Senior Vice President for Sustainability for Brookfield Properties, specifically the North American office portfolio. So Brookfield Properties is the entity within Brookfield Asset Management, which is one of the world's largest alternative asset managers. And we basically develop, own, and operate the real estate assets for that business. I specifically focus on about 160 office buildings across the U.S. and Canada, predominantly in New York, Houston, Denver, LA, San Francisco, Calgary, and Toronto, and the decarbonization planning and strategy associated with those properties.
Awesome. I think it'd be great to start a little bit with what you see. We could turn it down a little bit. We're like echoing in our back of our heads. Be great to hear a little bit from what you're seeing in terms of what are the drivers of decarbonization. I think, forever folks that own buildings and operate buildings have been looking at saving money, right? So for years they've said, hey, one of the ways to reduce your operating expenses is to save energy. You're going to save some money. I think we've come a long way from that being the only value driver around decarbonization. So it'd be great, Mike, I can start with you. What are you seeing as some of the drivers, even the more recent ones? I feel like these things are coming very quickly and evolving very, very quickly. Like maybe what you saw a year ago or 2 years ago to what you're seeing today in terms of where you're getting pressure to decarbonize.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, literally my job 3 years ago did not exist at the company. There was no sustainability lead or ESG lead for the office business. And I think, probably about 3 years ago, there was this wave of just investor interest when they suddenly started asking, and I was an asset manager at the time, what is your ESG business plan? What's your sustainability strategy? And to your point, like there had always been a strong business case for energy efficiency, for conservation, like LEED certification was kind of a default thing that we did with our developments. But all of a sudden they wanted a much more forward-looking strategy from their, the properties that they were invested in, and basically saying like, how are you going to confront this existential threat of climate change? Like, how are you going to leverage what we're investing in to actually help, solve this challenge? And so, we really kind of shifted strategies and just said, well, what can we do across our scale to make the biggest possible impact that we can that aligns with the values of our key stakeholders. And that would be like these very large sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, the big corporate occupiers who are in our office buildings, like, Accenture, EY, some of these big banks that, all of them have their own sustainability goals. And same thing with the investors. Like, they really want to align values with an owner operator who can help them kind of solve these challenges. And so I'd say that's the primary driver of most of what we do on the sustainability side now is, we are a value-driven organization, and we try to align values with our investors and occupiers, and that's creating quite a bit of change at scale.
That's great. Dana, what do you see in these drivers?
So I've actually focused in this area like Chris has for a long time. And so we've been doing this kind of work. I studied this kind of work in college a long time ago. And so I started as a mechanical engineer and then went to the owner's rep side. So my perspective is slightly different in that for about half of my career, I was trying to educate and convince people why they should consider this and what the value proposition for this kind of investment is. What I've seen then, and just to answer a question directly, because my job is working in this field, or has always been working in this field in some capacity, the initial interest in it would come to me, just like it would have come to Chris. And so my perspective started probably 15 years ago to 17 years ago when the European investors said they would no longer invest in American assets if we couldn't demonstrate their energy performance, their sustainability performance. And by demonstrating that, it's not the American way of saying like, oh yeah, we have a policy. But demonstrating that for them, it was actually showing what our plans were, what our investments would be, what our commitments are, what our results are, how we're going to measure them. And so that really began about 15 years ago in earnest. And so what I've seen is the biggest demand would be investors. They're one of the biggest drivers because if they won't invest in your company or they won't give you money, then you're done. The second thing that I've seen driving this is legislation, which also began for us, at least in New York City-based, circa 2007, 2009, with the passage of the first green codes. And I think we both worked together on developing those, which is crazy how fast that goes because that's when my son was born. Now he's applying to college. And so we basically worked on that first set of building performance standards, or the precursor to the building performance standards you see in most major cities in America now. Those are a huge driver because they're a requirement. Another big driver is the awareness of climate change and climate science. We focus on the data, we focus on the science, it shouldn't be political. And so we focus on risk management. Now, finally, although we've been talking about this also for over 15 years, actually 25 years, because I wrote a paper on this in college, which is that insurance and FEMA should demonstrate the risk of climate change in the way they price insurance and risk. And so that's another driver. And the last one, of course, is the tenants, right? Many of our large tenants, just like Michael's, are demanding this, and it's part of their own requirements. So that's often led by the government. The GSA was the first to say, probably again around 2005, I think, that they would only come to a building if it could demonstrate that it was Energy Star and LEED certified. And so it's drivers like that that really help.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting. In the 15 years I've been doing sustainability in real estate, a lot of the green and sustainability movement was to create more attractive buildings for tenants, say in the first half of my career doing it. In the last 3 to 5 years, it's really flip-flopped to be the investors. And it's really interesting because also what that means is it changes the focus from just one building at a time to the investors holding you accountable for an entire strategy that covers your whole portfolio. Whereas if you were doing this tenant by tenant, you're trying to attract tenants, you'd say, well, I've got 10 buildings, I'm going to pick 2, make them really green. So if anyone asks me for a green building, I can say I have one, and it's over here. That doesn't fly when you're talking to investors because most of these investors are invested either, both of you have REITs in part of your investments, they're investing in your whole portfolio. And now this decarbonization push is really interesting in that the acceleration we've seen in decarbonization in real estate is actually happening faster at the portfolio scale than at the individual scale. Whereas the green building movement, when it started, like I said, it's really one building at a time. It was this building got LEED, this building got LEED. Today, even there isn't even, sort of annoyingly, there isn't even a standard certification for a net zero building, for a zero carbon building. There's a couple competing, whereas there's lots of standards for net zero portfolios. So a lot of portfolios are following European-based standards, and some other kind of alignments and frameworks to say my portfolio is on a net zero trajectory as opposed to one building at a time. So that push is really, it's interesting that it's gone from the tenant pressure to be greener to the investor side of being greener. It'd be interesting to hear, you both mentioned the pressure from tenants around on the commercial side of pushing for sustainability and some of these decarbonization. Can you talk a bit about other asset classes and if there is as much pressure either in multifamily, or data centers and industrial? Are you seeing any pressure from tenants? Are they willing to pay more money? Are they willing to move into a greener building in those types of assets? Either one? Curveball.
It's a great question. Frankly, so just focusing on the New York City market, because that's where we're both based, even though we work in other markets as well. And before I was at Empire State Realty Trust, I was at JLL, and my role was for the Americas. So I saw all those trends and actually led our data center, our mission critical decarbonization practice, or the green data center practice. So I would say two things. The residential multifamily market is so hot right now that we actually have a lack of availability. And so we've been making our case the same way we've always made it for the sustainability and decarbonization in those assets, in that as we move towards the net zero programming, it's when we're at the useful life of that equipment anyway. This is really important, I think, for you guys to hear, since you're investors and you're all in real estate. Whether people are asking for it or not, or they're aware of it or not, it's a far better investment to do it that way. So our approach in the multifamily, I think most users love to see that you're being responsible. People love to compost because they feel like they're doing something about it. Low flow fixtures for water cost the same as not low flow fixtures, so that's an easy one. But on the energy side, which is the most important, we're actually finding now that we can make these cases based on money alone, and not just rental rate increases. It's also really hard to demonstrate a rental rate increase causation versus correlation. Is hard to say. It's only because of our work that we know that's part of it. So that's multifamily. On the data center side, I really think there needs to be regulation. So, with AI and the demands of AI on power and data, the amount of energy that data will require, I think we need to be really careful that we require that energy source has to be renewable, and that these data centers need to be built efficiently. And I won't get into the details, but it's entirely possible to build super efficient data centers, and we've known how to do that for over 20 years. So I think that needs to be regulated.
Right.
Yeah, I focus on the office side, but we have a global real estate net zero operating committee now, where we kind of meet with our peers on all the different operating platforms. So it's between retail, multifamily, industrial, any asset class essentially across the Brookfield ecosystem. And I'd say it really depends on the amount of control that we have as an owner operator in terms of like how we approach these types of things. On the commercial side, where we tend to control the utility meters and the general planning for what goes into a building from an energy side, then we have a lot more direct control, direct incentive to control these things. On the industrial side, on the other hand, they're typically, and the retail side too, triple net leases where it's really kind of up to the tenant to say like what they want to do strategically, and we're providing them with just the core and shell. We're actually trying to shift that now, though, so any new industrial property, we're trying to incentivize so that the tenant comes in on our meter so that we can actually leverage that ability to make that change. So I think that's very interesting. I think that, on the multifamily side, what we've heard is that, there may not be necessarily a willingness for residential tenants to pay more for a sustainable building, especially if there's restricted supply and they're just trying to get somewhere, right? But again, on the owner-operator side, it's a better investment to have a much better energy efficient building that is attractive to investors that you can sell when your hold period is up. So different drivers based on I think who's controlling which aspects of the business.
Right. On that front, I realized I probably skipped over this that we wanted to ask you earlier is, do either of you have targets? Do you have net zero targets? Are they portfolio wide? Are they, certain assets or certain portions of the portfolio? Just, I think one trend we've seen, there's been some anti-greenwashing legislation. There's been all sorts of challenges of organizations getting a little ahead of their out over their skis, saying we're going to be net zero by X, or we're already net zero because of these things. But I want to hear from you if you do have public targets, if you do have public goals, and then we'll get a little bit into what are some of the strategies that you're working with to get there. So, Mike.
So Brookfield Asset Management, again, our parent company, committed to something called the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative in 2021. It's a group of probably 300 plus asset managers globally. It represents literally trillions of dollars of assets under management. And as part of that commitment, it's a public-facing commitment. So every 5 years, you publicly review and commit your journey towards what we then decided to do as a net zero by 2050. And then each operating business within Brookfield Asset Management, so the property side, for example, made a subsidiary commitment to say, what milestones you want to hit along the way. And so for the entire global properties business, was about 7,000 properties across all asset types. It's a 50% reduction from a 2019 baseline by 2030. And then kind of even within that, each region, like North American office, will have its kind of own targets. And so recognizing that energy, like Dana was saying, matters so much, we've actually targeted a zero emissions electricity goal basically by 2026 for all of US office. Now Canada is going to be rolled into that as well, probably by 2030. And then by 2024, which is now, New York and Washington, D.C. will be zero emissions electricity by the end of the year.
Wow. All right. That's ambitious. Yeah. Dana.
So we have been a leader in this area for a long time, and we disclose all of our results in a different way than others. And so I think that's part of the differentiation that Chris wanted the two of us to highlight, because we own and manage our assets directly. So that gives us we still can't control everything our tenants do, but it puts us in a good position to try more than we can only do in a triple net lease. And that's a challenge in the industry in general that we could talk about after. But we have been carbon neutral since January 2022. That's for our entire portfolio. So all assets, we don't exclude any. That's a big part of disclosure and consistency and transparency that the industry needs. So we try to kind of lead by example and put that in our reporting so that other people just tell the truth and include everything, right? We see way too many owners and REITs and publicly traded companies highlighting their best building, like Chris said, and they just leave the other ones out. Like, you can't leave out your dogs. You have to put them in there. And you can differentiate what an efficient data center is versus an efficient office building, right? It's not just density of use. It's also what an efficient business use for that type of asset is. And that's a really important part of the work that we do. So our whole portfolio has been carbon neutral since January 1, 2022. And we've committed to target net zero, which is an 80% emissions for the Empire State Building by 2030 and for the whole portfolio by 2035. And we report on that every year in our sustainability report, how far have we come across those goals, what's helping, what's hurting, what's working, what's not working. We've published our net zero engineering case studies for every single building in the portfolio so that others can replicate what we've done, copy what we've done. We were actually talking before this around Class A versus Class B and C. And our goal is not only to do it in our buildings, it's to actually put an example out there that others can literally copy. If they don't have an internal team of brilliant engineers who can design these things for them, just use ours. Because the base list of measures you could choose from are very similar building to building if the typology is similar.
That's awesome. Would you explain what you mean, how you define the difference between carbon neutral and net zero? Since you have different targets for each.
I'm glad you asked, and I know the three of us, this is like a constant. It's tough because this is an area where it makes it really easy for people to mislead the public. So just to be clear, right? Carbon neutral allows you to use offsets, and that's not a bad thing because you can't just be net zero immediately, right? The fossil fuels, the energy sources in America are very heavy still, unfortunately, in fossil fuels. It takes time to change a grid, right? And it also takes time, if you're doing it right, and you have a great business case to change all the equipment in your building, right? You don't want to waste equipment that's still working. So carbon neutrality for us is number one, we reduce the emissions as much as we can by saving energy and transitioning over time to lower emissions sources and lower emissions systems. And then what's left that's sourced by fossil fuels, we offset 100% of that. And so we use wind power RECs for all of the electricity that the whole portfolio, including our tenants, use. And then for the steam and natural gas and the non-electric fossil fuels, we offset that with investments in a forestry project. Right now, it's a biodiverse forestry project outside of Cleveland, Ohio, because we couldn't find one in New York or in the tri-state area at all. But now we found one in New York, which is really exciting. And we're going to be hopefully transitioning to investing in that starting in January when our other agreement expires. So that's pretty cool. But that includes reduction plus offsets. The net zero means you're actually reducing the emissions. And that's what we all need to be doing. So I want to be really clear. If you're still doing offsets 10 years from now for more than, for larger than 20%, we're not in a good position as a world. So the emissions reduction of 80% from a 2000, in our case, 7 or 9 baseline, but by the Paris Accord is 2005 baseline, 80% reduction by 2050 is what we need. I think everyone here would understand that's now more like 2035, where we might not avoid catastrophic effects. And so our net zero goal means we'll reduce our emissions by 80% in the portfolio by 2035.
Let's get into a little bit of what you're actually doing in these properties. I think lots of engineers, architects in the room, developers. We're spending a lot of time here talking about retrofits and reducing carbon in these buildings. But it'd be interesting, maybe some of the most exciting things. We know there's lighting, there's LEDs, there's BMS controls. Maybe some of the exciting things you've seen, either newer ideas. Both of you are working simultaneously at the portfolio scale, but also at the individual building. So maybe, I guess, Mike, start with you. If there's anything that you like out there that you're saying, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. We think this can make a big dent.
Yeah. So I'm particularly excited about the energy procurement side, really. I think that when we're looking at a portfolio like the size of ours, when we did our kind of initial baselining, we found that on average, from an energy perspective, 80% of the energy in our buildings is electricity. And so we're looking to have the biggest possible impact on emissions reduction that we can. It's really addressing the source of that electricity. And so, for these types of office buildings, there's generally only so much you can do with on-site renewable supply. It's really, you have small roofs, and that's not really going to power the building. It might power an amenity space for part of the day. So we're really looking to say, well, how can you do, scaled clean energy procurement, excuse me. And I'm particularly excited about that because, depending on the region, there's tons of different opportunities of ways that you can do it in a really impactful way. And so for New York, for example, our strategy there is we're buying in-state, low-impact run-of-river hydro, basically from our sister company, Brookfield Renewable. And that's both the electricity and the renewable energy credits that come with it so that we can actually buy the power, reserve that capacity from the grid, and then have the certificates that allow us to make that kind of environmental claim that we want to make. And it's also 24/7. It's flowing into the grid at the same time that the properties are using that power. We're doing something very similar in Washington, D.C. region, except for the energy source there is actually going to be from nuclear power plants. Brookfield has an investment in Westinghouse Electric Company, which is the world's largest nuclear equipment manufacturer and supplier. And so we definitely believe in that as a technology for the decarbonization effort. And then for the Western regions, we're planning new build solar and wind projects, which would hopefully displace through the construction of these projects a larger amount of carbon than if we were to do even an in-state solution in some of those states. And so, in each of these regions, there's very, different kinds of solutions that we can have a scaled impact. And again, if 80% of the energy from your emissions is coming from electricity, that's a giant reduction relative to that baseline if you can get those in place.
That's awesome. I know that, I guess, even from a terminology standpoint, this idea of decarbonization that's come along in the last couple of years has really shifted the focus from just energy efficiency improvements, where we used to just look at all the energy used in a building, total up the square footage, you get an EUI, an energy use index. That was agnostic to the way the energy was produced, if it was fossil, if it was on-site, if it was off-site, and what the carbon footprint was. Now, when we're talking about decarbonization, it actually forces building operators to now kind of think outside the four walls of their building and say, instead of just looking at how much energy my building consumes on a site basis, I need now to know, where am I buying the energy? What kind of energy is it? If it's electricity, now there's thousands of options of where you get it. And I think even for this group, it's an interesting, I think we're all slowly wrapping our heads around the fact that signing contracts that buy renewable power, sometimes even if they don't come to your building with the electrons, is still an accepted measure of reducing your carbon footprint. There's a lot of hemming and hawing about like, well, you're not really buying it. You are buying it. It's a contractual agreement. And you're also pushing the market because that funding that you're developing and that you're pushing in to develop new solar or new renewables is actually driving the market forward. Exactly. So I think that is the procurement side of it was a curveball answer. I like it in terms of how you are reducing emissions in buildings. And Dana, I guess hear from you about some of the exciting things you're doing.
Sure. So obviously I agree with what Michael did, and we also purchase renewable energy. That's step one. But we that's one of the steps. Sorry, that was a different way of putting it. We're highly focused on reducing the energy usage in the building. So to make the answer quick, I'll actually use the legislation for New York State, which is called the CLCPA, and for New York City, which is called Local Law 97. And this isn't meant to be New York centric. There's lots of work in Connecticut, although they're really far behind, and we're trying to work with them more. Just to give a shout out, like Eversource is trying, if that's what serves New Haven. But we've been working to make the business case, because the CLCPA, for example, is the law for New York State, which happens to have its own grid. It's called the YSoA, right? And so that grid is the electric grid. And the law says that grid basically needs to be renewable electric power by, I think it's circa 2040, 2045. The work the assumption that gets New York State and New York City to net zero is based on an assumption that the buildings, all buildings, will also reduce their usage by 50%. So I want everyone to kind of realize that. You have to do both things. You need to, by 2030, 2035, hopefully, maybe 2040, but not longer. The grids will need to do their work, and the built environment has to do its work too. Our mission, other than to have happy tenants and high rents and a happy board, is to demonstrate that there's a stronger economic case for investing in doing this work than not so. And that's what our case studies continue to prove. Right? So the kinds of projects we're doing, just to answer his question specifically, we're doing some really cool stuff with building management systems. I know that's not sounding sexy, but that's basically software and programming and hardware and moving the whole market to open protocol, which is a huge shift because every big building has a building management system. We're working with a company based in Detroit, actually, to develop what will be true fault diagnosis detection and automation in a way that no other companies are doing it. Have been researching it for 15 years. They're all full of shit when they say that they're doing this. So we're actually working with a company who's working with us to do it. And we're even working with them to make it work. So that's really exciting for nerds like us about what it means for buildings and their performance. And then we're putting in heat pumps. We're putting in massive heat pumps in the Empire State Building to shift to super efficient electric power instead of district steam for heating, which we're using now, and entire systems that will be built now around much more efficient systems, healthier environments for the tenants. We already have leading indoor environmental quality, but these systems will allow us to bring in even more outside air than code requires. Everyone knows why that's important now. And we also are doing some really neat other kinds of projects with ventilation recovery systems, where we're doing heat recovery, heat transfer, heat exchangers, making systems more efficient. So I think they're cool, but I work in engineering. I don't know if everybody else thinks that's cool.
They are.
They are cool.
We're doing direct air capture. That's cool.
That is cool.
Right? We're actually taking the carbon out of the air in the Empire State Building and making little Empire State Buildings out of it, just to show people how it works. But we're also showing that you can sequester that carbon out of the air, carbon dioxide out of the air. So that's kind of fun.
That's awesome. And good marketing.
People love those little buildings, but right now I only gave them to the board. So you can come see me if you want to make a donation.
A carbon Empire State Building.
Isn't that kind of cool?
That's awesome.
So cute.
That's very cool. I think the from some of the things that you talked about, how do you identify or how do you evaluate these types of projects? I know even balancing between renewable purchasing options, retrofit projects, what are the types of KPIs or metrics do you use when you're thinking about what and how to prioritize projects?
I think one of the interesting things that we found is that, we mentioned before that not all tenants are necessarily willing to pay more. So you kind of have to make a nuanced business case in some cases where, especially with energy procurement, usually the way that we're buying, it's a net increase in electricity costs. But where that's going to show up is really, some of these office tenants who are looking for new space, for example, have now explicitly written into their lease that they want renewably powered buildings. Sometimes they want that option, right? And so if that means that we can be on a more select list of office properties that they're going to select from, then that's highly likely to accelerate the lease-up velocity, which means decreased downtime, more cash flow, like that flows right to NOI. You're de-risking the asset, which could really show up in like the exit cap rates for these projects. Increasing retention, so all these things are subtle layers within the asset underwriting that if you're able to tweak, you're more than paying for the cost of these types of contracts.
Right. Dana, how are you picking projects? It sounds like you rattled off a lot of cool projects. Is it dollar payback? Is it co-benefits or all the above? Or
Yeah, so I love that you asked this, and I don't know if anyone here teaches at Yale, but I would ask if anyone here is actually associated with the students or the curriculum. Please see me after class, because what we're really trying to do is work with students. And we did a whole course at NYU this year around how can the next generation succeed where we failed in incorporating the non-quantitative aspects, right? Everyone in our industry, whether they want to believe in it or not, absolutely knows that there's an outstanding payback associated with intelligent investments. There is no debating it. We more than prove it every single time we look at one of these. These are paybacks like the Empire State Building's first round of jobs that we started in 2010 had a payback of 3.1 years. That's outrageous. We reduced the energy usage in the building by over 40% with those measures. It was indisputably a far better investment than actually doing nothing, right? Our rental rates doubled in that period. And this was right after the market crash of 2009. So just consider this. So we have to make a payback based on payback, business case based on payback, excuse me. We justify our investments based on payback. The important part of it is also that there are so many other benefits, and Michael was starting to list them, right? We're de-risking assets, we're modernizing assets, we're improving health and wellness and air quality. We're reducing insurance costs. We're increasing the valuation of the asset, increasing the rental rates of the asset. We're making them more attractive, and we're retaining people more. There's less downtime, but none of those things are above the line for a CFO or a board. So my challenge to the class I taught or guest lectured at NYU was, how would you quantify the qualitative? Those things don't belong below the line. They belong above the line. And so I think that's something that's really important. But the punchline is we make a case above the line even without all that other stuff. But that other stuff is worth way more money than the way we make our case now.
That's awesome. That's the best answer. Yeah, I love it. Talking about money and talking about making the paybacks, want to talk a little bit about how you fund these projects? I know there's been lots of interesting products coming out, and folks, even today talking about where operators are putting things on their own balance sheets when they're looking out for additional outside funding. I know with the IRA that came through last year that some of that money is funneled towards buildings. I have to admit, we're finding a little bit of challenge finding it out there in the ether. Danny Goldman, one of our Yale classmates, I met him at an event that he was holding a few weeks ago, told him reminding him what I did, and he said, well, you're using the IRA, right? We worked so hard with the IRA. And I was like, we're trying. I'm still looking for it in the closet. So be interesting to hear a little bit about, are you using interesting financing solutions? Are you just putting these things in your balance sheets? Maybe Mike, start with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, same experience with the IRA, first of all. I mean, we're trying to find ways to use that. There's kind of a mismatch in terms of who can use those tax credits and which entity within Brookfield could potentially leverage those. So that's super challenging. But I would say, we do have a very large green bond program. It's not driving the majority of the progress, I'd say. I think what's more interesting from my perspective is that we've got these very large opportunistic development funds. And so when we go out and we redevelop a building, like we did one called 660 Fifth Avenue in New York City, it was a $400 million repositioning that we had to buy in this opportunistic fund that's targeting like a 20-25% return. Because of that repositioning, that building is now probably 40% less energy use. We basically took a large amount of steam consumption to a very small amount of steam consumption. So it's 95% electric now. And so it's like one of the best sustainability cases we have in our entire portfolio, but it was because we had this opportunistic pool of money that said we can take that kind of risk on, and that's where the biggest transitions come from. So it's more from our fund structure and the kind of business cases that are behind those types of returns that end up driving the biggest results.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and Daniel, get your input on it, that we have found a lot when we speak with our clients that most of these large real estate outfits are fund-based. So any of the existing funds, you come back to them today and say, hey, there's this push to decarbonize, there's this push to improve sustainability. They say, we'll start that with the next fund. The current fund, it's all been written. Like all of the underwriting is done. Investors already understand what their returns are going to be. We know what our run rate's going to be. We already, when we bought the buildings that went into that fund, say 5 years ago, we already underwrote all the work we were ever going to do. It's really hard for them to kind of crack the books back open and figure out how to put it into old funds. What we're seeing is everyone's really gearing up for the next funds to say, all right, let's start all of this underwriting from, like we're even getting called in as a consulting firm during due diligence on assets to say, okay, we don't want just the underwriting to be a new marble lobby and some nice paint job, and that's what we're going to underwrite when we buy the building. It's actually, okay, we know this building has to be more energy efficient at time of exit, and we're not going to call you in 3 years into the whole period. We're going to like literally underwrite, taking out the boiler, updating the windows, like doing those things. So when they go into the deal, you can't come back in later and have somebody green, like one or two of you, like knocking on the door of the asset manager saying, hey, you never asked me anything when you bought the building. I'm here to tell you, you got to go put $50 million back into it. So we are hearing that, we're definitely seeing that folks now in the large institutional space, for every new asset, for every new due diligence, for every new deal they're going into, all of this retrofit work and all this decarbonization, maybe not all the way to net zero is being funded, but at least getting the buildings on the path so that when they build a plan for the building and when they go to sell it, they're actually de-risking that sale because they can say, here's the plan to net zero, it's got 10 steps, we've done 5, and here's what we think the cost is for the rest of the steps, so that you're taking out that uncertainty, because every uncertainty, you just lose money on the transaction, right? If the uncertainty is, well, I don't know how expensive it's going to be to get us to net zero, you say, well, here's what we think it's going to cost, and we've already given you a roadmap. So I think it is changing the way that these deals happen and when the underwriting happens. But I want to hear how you're funding these projects, Dana.
We self-finance them, and actually every client I ever worked with when I was at JLO, which was like hundreds, always self-financed unless they were a municipality, university, school, or hospital, in which case they would get a different source of funding. So I think that's important to note because the sources of funding, like IRA, are available in different ways to market businesses or housing, for example, than they are to the MUSH market, right? So there's different sources of funding at different rates of interest than there are for different asset types. For us right now, at least, it doesn't make sense not to self-finance because we get a way better rate on our money to do it that way. And why would I ever outsource the business that saves my company money to someone who's making these investments? So if you have access to capital, I would say it's almost always best to do it that way, to self-finance. That being said, we continue to keep our finger on the pulse of IRA, which is really an infrastructure bill, where REITs can't really directly get that money, but there are ways, I think, that we'll be able to leverage it. And it's great no matter what, because it's going towards projects that we all need. Right? It's really geared towards huge infrastructure jobs. That's why it's not easy for us to get it for our single building projects, because it's supposed to convert coal and natural gas fired power plants to renewable, right? It's really meant to do things like that. And that's good, right?
Oh, we need that. I mean, we've already touched on the renewable side of things.
Yeah, so it's not like we're like, we need them.
No.
We'd love to have it.
Yeah. A couple quick things I just want to get in before, I do want to maybe open up for one or two questions. A couple of things that we would be remiss not to really highlight. One, Dana, you mentioned it briefly. In New York City, we have what's called Local Law 97, which is literally a law that was passed back in 2019, goes into effect next year, which puts a carbon emissions limit on every building that's over 25,000 square feet. So there are about 60,000 buildings in New York City that as of next year, if they don't hit a certain emissions limit, they're going to pay a fine. There's some ones in the news. One, Bryant Park, that was the Bank of America building, built as a super green building. When it was designed, is going to owe $1 million a year in fines beginning in 2030. The fines actually, the limits ratchet down. So next year, they're at a certain level. By 2030, they get harder. New York City, DC, St. Louis, Denver, Seattle, the state of Washington, Boston, these cities, and it's coming to like 50 more cities near you. This is coming very quickly. The cities have really sort of dropped the hammer and said, this is the only way we can see to reduce the energy use in buildings. Buildings constitute 40% of the carbon footprint globally, but they constitute like 70% of the carbon footprint in most major cities. So this is a way that cities are really pushing down hard. So I just want to get that out there. Be aware if you're building a building in any of these cities, be aware of these laws. Do the math, figure out if your building is going to comply with these types of emissions laws. So maybe I'll open it for 1 or 2 questions. I know we're going to hit time. Back in the middle. Yeah.
In the retrofit environment, not in a giant office building, where the tenant, either because it's a multifamily or it's retail, and they're controlling the energy, how do you get to that?
I can try, and then I don't know what Michael has to say. We have that case lots of times. The way that we've handle it actually started a long time ago when we realized that would be one of our biggest challenges was we can't, the same way we can't have net zero cities or countries without the grid and the building, you also can't have a net zero building without the tenant and the owner, right? There are buildings that are base building systems, that means owner controlled, and there are buildings that are tenant systems, and that means the tenant's gonna have a lot of power over them. So we have high performance design and construction guidelines that are in every single lease we write. And all of our tenants are required to comply with them. And we use that leverage to help us help you, tenant, because at the end of the day, what we're asking them to do saves them money and makes them money and has an ROI far shorter than the duration of their lease. And so that's how we do it.
And I would just say one of the things that we've learned through this is that a lot of this stuff is not going to happen overnight. So some of these things, especially with tenant spaces you can't get access to, they have systems that they're controlling. This may be a 10 or 15-year plan, right? You may say, all right, we're going to have to schedule something so that we go into tenant spaces when they roll, when you get access back to it. So that's why we have tried to push back these laws a little bit to give building owners and then the stakeholders some time. But yes, it's not going to be able to be done overnight. Maybe one more. Yeah.
Just curious, you mentioned replacing steam heating in the Empire State Building with heat pumps. That seems like a very challenging infrastructure thing for an old building like that. What does that look like in practice?
So I'm glad you asked it that way. So we are not replacing the steam. For the exact reason you noted, right? The Empire State Building is a 1931 building, and her steam system is beautiful and could bring a tear to your eye. What we've done is to focus on ways to reduce that steam usage to as low as possible, have it remain in place for resiliency and redundancy, because we all live through Sandy, and we know what that can look like. And I get in fights with some of the purists about this, but resiliency also is part of sustainability. And so our goal is to reduce that steam usage. We've already reduced it by well over 40% through better controls. We have a long way to go that's already charted in our plans, like Chris mentioned. And now we just rigged in our heat pump system where the floors that we're fitting out now will move to the same air handling units we'll reuse. Really good sustainability story. We're adding, you could reuse the same VAV boxes with a reheat coil and start using that for heating and cooling electric-powered, super efficient heat pump. So we'll all still have the steam for a 10-year-long transition and for backup, just in case, we have polar vortices, it could be -10. The heat pumps might not do the trick. We might need both, but generally we're going to use as little steam as possible.
Where do the compressor units live? Are they on certain floors or up on, not up on the roof? Flat roof.
They're large heat pumps, and they live in dunnage around our loading dock. We have space. Yeah, we get really creative. But there are ways to do it. There was
awesome.
more. I don't know if you have time for him.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much.